Welcome to this re-recording of a webinar session for the Right for Publication seminar on They Say, I Say. We're going to be talking about conversational dynamics of literature reviews and feedback. I'm Christina Quinn, the director of CSU Rates, and today we explored literature reviews and kind of the processes by which we read and incorporate what others have said into what it is that we're saying with our work. We talked about ethical AI and disclosure. We talked about some steps that you can take in your reading process. Many of them you likely already do or know about, but it's good to have some reminders. And also then how it is that you digest what it is that you've read and work it into the conversation that you are having with others so that then they can understand the context of your work, the meaning and the significance of your work based on what has already come before. It's more than just looking for the gap and identifying the gap, for example, in knowledge. And we'll talk about feedback then as a continuation of that conversation. If we're starting with reading and integrating what it is that they say into what it is that we say or I say about our story, then we're also getting feedback through this process of publication. And we want to talk a little bit about and kind of pre-set up some of the ways that we're going to talk later in the seminars about responder feedback and reviewer feedback. When you're integrating what it is that you say about the work that you've done, it's really, really helpful for you to consider that story, the research story that you're telling folks about the work that you've done. We talk about it broadly as a story, but really what it is a kind of there's a past that has something that has come before the work that you've done. There's a present, which is the work that you have done, or you're sharing with your readers in that kind of present tense way. And then there's the future of them being able to pick up with it and future topics and future research that can be done. And so all of that happens on a continuum of text that you write out and share with your readers. It doesn't necessarily happen in a chronological way. We've have other sessions where we talk about topical and thematic arrangements and logical arrangements of what it is that we do when we tell the stories of our research. But here we're going to be talking about it as what has come before, in particular in terms of what we read, and then the literature review that we incorporate for our own readers to understand what we've done, and then what it is that we can then later on understand in the feedback and the ongoing conversation. We'll take a look at Ronald Kellogg and Alison Whitford's piece on training advanced writing skills. It's an oldie but a goodie. I like it. It reminds us that deliberate practice is really important for us to be able to become really good writers. And so topically, it's relevant to CSU Rates, but it's also just really well written. And what they're doing is setting up some groundwork for us to understand how deliberate practice is important at the undergraduate level in particular, so that folks who are coming into universities and writing programs at universities need to build skills in order to then leave the universities with some very practical and tangible skills in writing to do knowledge work later on. So let's see how they're setting this up and talking about what has come before and what they're doing. So in this piece, you can see kind of a layout of a standard article. Their thesis statement is super clear and right up front. It's in that very first paragraph. They've set up the context of the national data so that there's some context already for the conversation. But they say that the core problem is an insufficient degree of appropriate task practice distributed throughout the primary, secondary, and higher education curriculum. Their thesis is that curriculum must move forward from one based on instructing writers to one of training writers. Okay, and then they have a training system that they'll talk a little bit about. But before that is the literature review. So this is an APA style journal. They'll use an APA style in citing their sources and who it is that they're in conversation with. But what I want to pull is from this second paragraph to demonstrate and show how, at least in this field, psychology, educational psychology, and then also within this paper, how smoothly that they've been able to move from one idea to the next and in kind of building out a broader context for us to understand the work that they're doing. and what they're saying. And so you can see kind of how they're moving from one source and citation to another. I'll read through this just so that you can get a sense of the flow of the ideas. But this is one where sources are integrated. What it is that they have said has become already part of the story that Kellogg and Whitford are telling about writing and skill development K through undergraduate. So they say effective writing skills are central in both higher education and the world of work that follows. One's ability to compose an extended text is the single best predictor of success in coursework during the freshman year. Citation, right? So that we know that there's proof of that existing. They're not just saying it out of nowhere, right? They're not making it up. Gains in informative and analytical writing ability are moreover taken as a good indicator of the value added by higher education. Also, the indicator is already documented. So notice that they're moving from effective writing skills and that it's a predictor of success. And then gains in that ability are a good indicator of the value. And then finally, a large share of the value added by businesses in knowledge-based economy is codified in written documents, placing a premium on a highly literate workforce among college graduates. And then they move forward from there. So notice how they're very smoothly integrating what it is that others have said into what it is that they're saying currently to lay the groundwork for the argument that they're going to put forth and their own data and research on how it is that they're studying in undergraduate classes. Professors have given assignments, but have very little time to work with students on the practice of writing and to be able to give the immediate feedback and skill building. It's an interesting piece, actually. It predates AI and AI tutorials and other kinds of writing, but I think that what also highlights is the very necessary skill of being able to write still that exists within an AI economy. Oh, and here are our citations, just as a reminder. So this is in APA format, and it's just clearly structured out. Uh, I highly recommend that if you are yet not clear how you're moving from what it is that they say and integrating it into the story that you're telling of your own research, get something like a templates guide. Feel free to email us at CSU Writes so that we can send you out one. If you're not participating in the Write to Publish course, we're happy to share those out. Or you can just even look online. I love Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein's book, They Say, I Say. It's written for undergraduates. However, the templates and the moves that they're talking about in academic writing are relevant across the board. You may have to take some of the ways that they've framed those templates and adjust them for your own discipline. There may be some of the templates that they're talking about, for example, with I don't know, introducing a quote or writing a summary. There might be some things that are just a little clunky or might not be part of your discipline for the most part, or part of that type of article that you're writing. But most often we will be disagreeing with someone else's point, right? We'll be making your own point into the discussion, for example, or we might be introducing a new point of view. So I think that there's some ways that you can take templates like this and translate them to your own professional academic and research writing. Wendy Belcher, the author of Write Your Journal article in 12 weeks, reminds us that there are some common mistakes that we would want to avoid. One is citing a source too much, right? You want to make sure that you have read widely and that you integrate appropriately. You don't want to cite irrelevant literature. I don't know at this stage kind of how often that might happen, but sometimes we make decisions to shift an argument to retell the story in a new way, and it may be that on a revision or through editing, you might need to make sure that you are not citing irrelevant literature, things that you thought you were going to be in conversation with, but it turns out you're not. Oversighting definitions, you want to clarify how you're using a term, if you can, as smoothly as possible and integrate it within the text. Oftentimes, excuse me, you want to avoid misattributions, meaning that you're attributing whole systems of thinking that are incredibly complex and have perhaps dozens, if not hundreds, of additional kind of contributions to shaping a system of thought and to attributing it to one person. So just make sure that when you're attributing sources that you're doing that well. And I love this kind of piled higher and deeper comment where it says, I added more references to the manuscript, Professor Jones, and great. Did you really read all of these? Of course. And then it's like, define read. And so we'll talk a little bit about our reading strategies and what we can do to fine tune and clarify for our purposes to be strategic on how it is that we will be reading and what we need to do for reading those sources. In citing citations, we want to make sure that we find original sources and that we're not citing what has other people have cited, that we go actually to the original text, making sure that we have read that on our own, right? Citing asides means that the point isn't clear from that article and it's a side point. And if you're pulling off of an article's side point, maybe there's a gap in the knowledge that they kind of gesture towards, but they didn't fully pick up. If you're integrating that as what you're picking up and researching, then if it seems like it was a toss away, not fully the point of that article, you'll want to integrate and explain in your discussion or in your setup in your literature review why you're doing that. Citing derivatives, those could be other types of documents, magazines, newspapers, that blogs that draw on that topic, but aren't necessarily the original sources. Once again, the only caveat for that one is if you are in a field where, let's say, journalism and media communications, for example, you might actually be working with newspapers as your primary sources, magazines or blogs as some of your primary documentation and information. And so you would want to cite those as primary sources and not as derivatives. Quoting too much, that can be what we call quilting or bring the like patchworking, when you're just patching things together from other people. That's really not your ideas, but it's their ideas, and you're making it sound like it's yours, but you're patching it together. Just make sure that you summarize and you paraphrase and you evaluate the related literature in ways that gives credit where credit is due, and that it's clear that you're summarizing or paraphrasing someone else's work or ideas, and that you're integrating it into the story that you're telling of your own work. And I think the Kellogg and Whitford piece is a really good example of not quoting too much. It's not patch quilting sources together, quotations together. It is really building a story so that we can understand the context and the literature that grounds their own argument. So there's a balance there. Just take care that you're not omitting citations and that you are clear on who are the scholars who are arguing certain things and what the research really is showing, that you can go back to those sources, that you can identify them for your readers as well. At some point, you may find that in looking at what they say versus what it is that you say through that writing process, that there's a point of comparison that may happen. And if you go from, in this quotation, this comic on the neurobiology of writing, it's kind of a play on a joke on that process of what can happen when you go from thinking and working through ideas that are kind of mechanical to all of a sudden having some sort of internal reaction where you're curious about whether you really measure up in relation to what it is that they say. They've already said it better. You become insecure, slightly confused. There's fear, there's panic, there's hesitation. If you start to get those feelings as you're working through your literature review, it's a good time for a break and just step away for a moment and kind of collect yourself and acknowledge what's happening. But also then note that you are now no longer focusing on the text itself and the work that you're doing externally. You're focused internally on who you are as a writer. And so that neurobiology of writing that PhD Comics points out, Jorge Cham, that you just really need to shift the focus back to the text and the work at hand. So the working the text, I pulled this from some Chronicle of Higher Education pieces a few years ago where they were talking about a rise of plagiarism. And it's just a good reminder that if you are pulling from what other people say and you are not giving them credit, that's and unethical, right? And so you want to make sure that you're always giving credit where credit is due. The elephant in the room with this one is if you're using any LLMs for your literature review, either compilation or for your summaries, it may be that it is pulling from copyrighted material or material in ways that's also could be inaccurate. So you just want to make sure that you are doing your due diligence to use AI as a compiler for the documents that you need to read through in the same way that you might use a database, for example, doing those searches and kind of identifying and kind of screening through the material that would be most helpful and most useful for your conversation to ground your conversation and your learning about the topic at hand. But that it's about your professional development, and it's also giving credit where credit is due. So make sure that you're just reading through it. Boris Streepy, I just love his reminder on research and scholarship that AI can be very, very helpful. However, co-writing with any kind of system, AI system, means that you are always starting with your work first and your writing first. Kari Weaver's ethical disclosure guideline for her artificial intelligence disclosure framework, AID framework, gives us different categories, 14 categories for us to see where we can either integrate AI, LLMs into our methods and methodology. It may be, for example, that in using AI to gather sources for your literature review, particularly if you're doing a scoping review, it will be part of your methodology. What program are you using? What version are you using? When are you using it? What are your prompts? What are your outputs? What are the URLs for those? You want to make sure that you're tracking all of those for tracking what they say. Notice that there's a remove as soon as you pull from an AI tool like that. It's really not what they say yet. You have what it is that the LLM has said that they say, but it's still your responsibility to do your due diligence to go through and read those original texts. But it may be that, towards number 10, 11, 12, or excuse me, 11, 12, 13 on the writing, reviewing the translation perhaps of a text that may be in a language not your own, that if you're using AI for those purposes, then you would perhaps acknowledge it, maybe less of a need to integrate it into your methodology and into your citations. But you would want to check with your journal, the journal you'll submit to, just to confirm what it is that they require in their own disclosure and AI disclosure. So let's talk about you digesting the documents that you're in conversation with. The folks that you're in conversation with have laid out their ideas, laid out their research, laid out their scholarship for you to engage with, to have a conversation with. And so let's talk about 7 steps that you can use to designate and kind of go through and digest and then disclose, and then just with one reminder of a C to credit, which we've already kind of talked about. But the first thing is designating time to that process. Make sure that you give enough time for you to be able to read through what you've gathered, and how it is so that you know how you're going to be integrating those ideas into your work. If we go back to the example, the Kellogg and Whitfield example, that was 3 different citations within 3 different sentences, and it was very smoothly integrated into the single story that they wanted to tell. That was one paragraph of dozens through the article that includes citations that are integrated that way. That takes time, it takes effort. It means also that you know your sources well, that you can do that and give credit where credit is due. You may want to think about how much time you want to give to this process. I would highly recommend not binge reading, right? We tend to misunderstand if we binge read. So making sure that you have it sectioned out in doable times and chunks of time. And that we want to separate out our reading from our drafting and our editing sessions so that we can have perhaps multiple days where we take notes, we have a distance, perhaps space even, that we write in one place or draft in one place, that we read and edit in other places. So you want to think about what your processes are for that. All right, there we go. Oh, my goodness. So when in digesting what it is that they say, take a moment to read slowly and process the key sources, the primary sources that you need to be working with. Those documents that you are largely in conversation with. It'll make your life a lot easier when you get to the discussion section, for example, of your piece, as you're integrating it into your literature review. So take some time with those principal documents And then I highly recommend a 3-step writing process where you pre-read and just skim through, that you read without a highlighter in hand, without kind of clicking and tagging in Zotero. Just read through it and get a sense for what really is contained there. What are the nuances of the argument? How do you understand your work in relation to that work? And then you go back and you can take some notes, summarize it, make connections to other texts. And I have a process that I'm going to recommend for you then following up and then distinguishing your work from what it is that they say to what it is that you say. If you go through too quickly, or if you've just highlighted text for you to pull from, it's very easy for you to pull it in and then, even if you're crediting, have a difficult time then integrating it into the story that you want to tell, because it's not clearly distinguished between what it is that you're saying versus what it is that they've said. And so it's pretty easy to take some notes on what they've said. Here's a 2-entry system. You can use it digitally. You can build it out and do it hard paper, draw a line down the side of the center of the paper and just put content from the text on one side, what's important for you to remember. If you're doing exams or if you are preparing for your defense, having notes and a record of what it is that you have read through and what your thought about those texts really, really helpful. And being able to distinguish what it is that they've said in that left-hand column from the content, the main concepts, right? The ideas, what you want to remember from what they've put forward, to your response, which is in the right-hand column, connections to other texts, perhaps to your own work, to words and things that you don't understand yet, definitions you want to look up, conversations you want to have with your advisor or other colleagues in the field, what surprises you, what you want to remember, and your own ideas going forward and how you might build off of this. All of that could stay in the right-hand column. When you do that double entry note-taking system, it allows for you to maintain visible and kind of distinct um, respect for both sets of ideas. Whose idea is whose, and then you can cite it more clearly. That gives you some distance. I also recommend, as I mentioned before, some temporal distance and maybe some, spatial difference in time away from your reading and then your writing, so that you can integrate it well and give you time to think about it, mull over what they've said. Depending on how complex the reading is, that will determine how much distance you probably need in time and space. But if you're working with heavy theory, it may take a while for you to chew on some of those ideas. If it's data and information that is something that you readily understand and you're just integrating in relation to the work that you've done, that would probably be pretty quick and easy, though. Then you get to decide what data, what analysis, what figures, what references, what information really works for your piece. How are you going to set up what they've said in relation to what it is that you've said, so that you can then make this project your own, giving credit where credit is due. Their work is now integrated and their ideas are integrated into your own. But it's always in service and to the story that you're telling, and your ability to give credit to them for their ideas and maintain that distance, even within your own writing, means that you have control over the story that you're telling, and you know that you're not just picking up their ideas and running with it. So here are some helpful suggestions and things to consider when you're making decisions about the sources. So in what way does that original source influence your own work? What do your readers need to know about that source in relation to your own research and your argument? You'll need to make a decision for the purpose that you have. What's going to work best? Is it a paraphrase? Is it a summary? Is it some sort of combination or a quote? Right? What signal phrases? We'll talk more about that in a bit. Like, what templates can you bring in that will help introduce source material and separate your words from theirs? You want to consider if you've relied on one too much, or if you've kind of pulled on sources and kind of sandwich them together in ways that doesn't work to tell the story that you are controlling, but is more like giving over the story to their words, to their ideas. And then quote sandwiches, that's where you introduce a quotation as an idea that that's relevant to the work, that in the argument that you're putting forward, then the quotation, and then you build off of that to move your own argument forward. So it's a way to kind of make sure that you are not just dropping in quotations and making your reader guess on the connections, for example. In that regard, quote sandwiches are a great way to describe what it is that that work is doing and how it relates to your own. So that quote sandwich means that you have a maintained control over the ideas and descriptions of your work. And then, of course, disclosing, making sure that you understand in advance what you're going to disclose and how you're going to disclose it. Usually that's in your formatting guides for your journals or for your course. And if you have used any AI, that you're disclosing accordingly. Last, giving credit. It's part of our ethical conduct for research. It's required. So follow your own community guides for those. It could be that you are publishing an IEEE journal, or it could be an APA journal, or wherever it is that you have your guidance for giving credit where credit is due. Just make sure that you follow that. And if you're in doubt, it's good to try to give more credit than less credit, for example, in those bibliographies. And last, let's talk about feedback, because next, when you submit, your reading goes out, your story goes out to other people in the field whom you might have already cited or might be in conversation with. And so the feedback that you're going to get back will be about the story that you have told, about the work that you've done, but also note that it may be, again, in conversation with folks who are out there reading your work. The feedback that you get, just remember that it's not all the same. Not all feedback is accurate. Not all feedback is kind and supportive from reviewers. Even from advisors, sometimes it can be difficult to take. So try not to take it personally. Just take a look at the feedback and treat it as feedback and not as personal. The best feedback ultimately is targeted to the work on the page and not to the person. It'll come from a variety of readers. So my recommendation is early on, if you can, get some early stage feedback from different groups, from people who are non-experts, but who are good readers of academic or research texts, some feedback from your advisor, of course, and making sure that you have good insights from various quarters for you to be able to make decisions about the story that you're telling, how you're telling it, whether it's landing well or not. And your decision at that point, based on the feedback that you've gotten, how you will change that story, how you will adjust it. If you're working on a co-authored document, of course, if you're the lead author, you'll be the person who then identifies and addresses all of that. It'll help to improve the quality of the manuscript. Ultimately, feedback is fabulous for that. It'll help you develop expertise in the field through that feedback and writing process. And just know that there are 4 kind of big areas of feedback. Not all of them are part of the manuscript publishing process, but it's helpful for you to know that you may get some corrective feedback-ish, directive feedback, interactive feedback, and evaluative feedback. Corrective feedback is where the reviewer makes corrections on the page and you do little. Sometimes you'll get some feedback of like pointing out how things might be corrected on a particular page, or there might be some typos or things like that. I've even had it happen between British journals and American journals on differences in spelling, right? Directive feedback points out specific problems and offers suggestions, but it doesn't, right? They don't make the changes. Interactive feedback may happen in the earlier stages if you are sharing a document for feedback with a colleague or with an advisor, and that's where the reviewer gives some feedback and you might have a conversation then about it on the commentary. Or evaluative feedback where this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. There's some sort of judgment call, grades, right? A, B, C, D, F. Or it could also be accept for publication, don't accept, right, for publication. These are probably the most common. If you have some sort of interactive exchange, it's usually with the editor of the journal. My recommendation when you're thinking about looking for feedback or understanding the feedback, first start with your writing process and what you're going to be putting out there, because you will fully understand what your reviewers are giving you feedback on if you've already gone through and done your due diligence to understand the guidance that they've been given by the journal. So this is an example from Wendy Belcher's work on writing your journal article in 12 weeks. And this is for an APA kind of social sciencey journal where the journal would be asking from reviewers, like what are the general strengths of the article? And then for content about argumentation, claims of significance. Is it connected to the scholarly literature? The methods, the evidence, and are there errors? Looking at the organization, right? Do the first few paragraphs draw the reader in? Is it subheaded well? Does it raise questions that go unanswered, or is everything kind of pulled together and united throughout? Is it repetitive or digressive? Does it miss transitions? Do you lose interest at any place? Are any sections too long? Does the conclusion summarize the article? And if not, like what might tie the article? So notice, if not, specify what might tie it together. Here it's asking reviewers to give some guidance to writers. Is the argument organizing the article, or is the evidence problematically kind of running the show? Meaning it's kind of dropped in, evidence is dropped in, but not fully synthesized, meaning that the story that's being told about that evidence is not yet clear and drawn out and given to the reader. Looking at the contribution, is it give valuable information and insight? Would it be of a interest to the readers of the journal? Is the argument justified? And are the claims significant ultimately for the field itself, given the findings and the evidence used? And if not, how might it be improved? So notice how kind this is in looking towards improving the quality of the article and argument that you've submitted to this journal. And then ultimately, what did you find most intriguing about the article? So when you get the feedback back from this journal that you've submitted to, you can anticipate that you will have tried to your very best hit all of these necessary areas to give the reader something that is of value and that is well written and organized in this way. My recommendation across all asks for feedback, whether those be to colleagues, to advisors or others, or tracking the feedback from reviewers, just write it down. What are they saying about your writing so that you can then target strategically ways to practice and improve? Going back to Whitford or Kellogg and Whitford's piece on practice, writing in deliberate practice. We're still practicing at this stage. Doesn't need to be a fancy system. It could be a journal, an Excel, Word document, and it just gives you a way to distance yourself from the feedback that you've received. It can be over a series of articles. Definitely for the article that you've gotten, finding a way to track that. And while this is not the focus of this presentation, if you need to have guidance on how to create a table or a grid of feedback and then do reader response, reviewer response, please reach out. We're happy to help. Look for repetitions, find patterns in the feedback that you've been receiving, and then look for ways to strengthen and make it easier for you in the future to not receive those same errors. And that helps you kind of target your learning and appreciate your growth over time. When you track comments, it's really helpful for you to identify certain themes. Is it a challenge with how you're expressing the research story or scholarly content? Is it simple sentence level errors that you're not cleaning up? You're not maybe identifying even. Maybe you're not seeing them. It could be word choice errors or clarity of expression errors or wordiness, passive voice, jargon, English language learner. Sometimes there's very specific challenges like articles in the English language that might be posing some problems. So those are pretty easy for you then to identify. And we now, of course, have such great systems with LLMs that can help us clear up some of these. You just want to make sure that the voice is still your own voice and not you have not become ChatGPT, for example. All right, folks. Well, happy writing. Reach out if you have any questions or want to follow up about how to talk about what they say and what it is that you say so that we can all talk about then what it is that you say. All right, folks. Thanks so much.